Hello and welcome to another A-Level English language video with me, Paul, from the QE here at Darlington. This one is on the language change topic of political correctness, a thorny issue, one not very far away from the media at all times. Often we pick up newspapers like the Mail Online here, and we have headlines like this: Has Britain gone mad with political correctness? So strong, emotive, hyperbolic headlines like that. We have quotations from famous people. Quotations like this: these politically correct language initiatives are misguided and harmful. They create highly entitled professional victims who expect to be free from any offence, and they engender a stifling atmosphere where all individuals walk on eggshells lest they might commit a linguistic capital crime. So again, very strong hyperbolic language being used. Let's go back to basics here and try and define what actual political correctness is in terms of language. So do a dictionary definition of the noun phrase, and then try and think of particular examples of politically correct language, and then think, well, why have these particular phrases come into use, particularly in the last 20, 30, 40 years? And then, what are some of the arguments? What are the arguments for the creation of linguistic politically correct words, and what are some of the arguments against? Okay, so 4 tasks for you to be doing there. If I were you, I'd be pausing the video there and writing down your answers. Okay, so let's have a look at this definition of the word political correctness. So political correctness really describes that language can be adapted to minimize social inequality. Okay, so it's all about changing language. So it's like change from above, I suppose, rather than change from below, change from above. And it's the idea that people from up above can encourage others to use language, and that will minimize social inequality. And what it tries to do is to avoid language that does these things here. So language that insults, language that marginalizes, language that seeks to control other people. And it has, particularly in its sites, language that is, and it's these words here, these affixed words here with the IST ending or ISM endings as a suffix. Sexist language, racist language, ageist language, ableist language, and lots of other isms. So it's trying to challenge the kind of usage that's embedded in people's speech. And I suppose it's based on the idea that language doesn't just reflect social attitude, but actually it helps shape those social attitudes. So this is an idea that's explained in the AQA textbook on page 81. It's called linguistic relativity, the idea that the language we use to talk and write about things can determine the way that we think about them. So this is linguistic relativity, aka the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Okay, so it's quite an interesting notion, that, isn't it? That language not only kind of reflects the way that we think, but actually the language that surrounds us all the time determines the way that we think about such a thing. And maybe a good example of that is the very word itself, political correctness, because political correctness seems to be the only noun phrase or word that's used to describe this phenomenon. And it's a word that's it's a pejorative word. It's a negative word. It's difficult to use that word in a positive way these days. So you could argue that people are being nudged towards feeling about the concept in a negative way simply because the word itself is charged with negative meanings. So that's called linguistic relativity, or the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Let's look at some examples of words which were deemed politically incorrect and their alternatives. Half-caste, for example. So this is the adjective that's used to describe a child that comes from mixed race offspring. And so mixed race would be an alternative, and people objected to the adjective half-caste because it suggests something incomplete. something less than whole. There was that famous GCSE anthology poem that we used to do with John Aggard called Half Caste that made the point really well. Okay, stewardess is one of a host of words where the female form has this ESS suffix on the end. So that would be the original term, stewardess, and a current day alternative would be flight attendant, which of course doesn't draw attention to the gender of the person doing that occupation. Okay, so stewardess reveals the person's gender. The suffix ESS suggests that the male term is the original, so more important. So this is what's called a marked term, whereby, putting the suffix on the end there, you're marking out the gender as being a particularly important person, important part of that job. And here's a third example. So some people have objected to the phrase disabled person, and they've wanted to change that to something like person with disabilities. Now you might say, oh, well, the difference between the two is quite negligible because it's a similar word that's being used, but they would argue, well, it's different because you're actually taking the focus away from the adjective disabled by putting it at the back end of the phrase, and you're putting more the focus on the person itself. So they would argue that disabled person is a bit of a dehumanizing label, and it characterizes people by their alternative. And the alternative version takes the focus away from the disability. So those are three good examples of supposedly un-PC language, and here those are three examples of the alternatives. Okay, so let's think about some of the arguments that people make for the use of PC language. Primarily, this language helps to shape social attitudes. So by encouraging people to use words like flight attendant rather than stewardess, it sends out a clear message. It sends out a message to people that, they shouldn't have these stereotypical expectations that, these people who work in aeroplanes are necessarily going to be female. So it encourages people to change their attitude. It challenges their assumptions about things. Also, politically correct language, it kind of acts as a symbol that society is changing. Society is becoming more inclusive. Society is becoming more equal. And people who argue on behalf of politically correct terms often show that the arguments against them are often so-called straw man arguments. They're kind of outrageous examples which don't bear much relationship to reality. They're hyperbolic, they're blown out of proportion. You've got people who say things like, ooh, you can't use the term blackboard anymore, or you're not allowed to say bar black sheep. Okay, so what they do is they misrepresent the arguments that are being put forward in order to demolish the PC argument. Okay, now in terms of arguments that people use against PC terms, one of the main ones is that people feel like they're being constrained. And their freedom of speech, speech and conversation is being constrained. They can't speak their minds without getting into trouble. Okay, so people don't like that. Also, people feel that it's actually pointless constructing these words because what does language do? It just reflects social attitudes. It doesn't actually shape them, i.e. that people's attitudes come first and then you get the language that's used to represent those attitudes later on. Some feel it's counterproductive because it actually creates resentment. If you're going to create new terms to describe people with disabilities, then actually what you do is you stir up resentment against those groups, and it's counterproductive in that way. And the other argument that people make is that, look, well, language always changes, and you can change things to alternatives, so stewardess becomes flight attendant, but then it just becomes a kind of euphemism treadmill where after a few years, the new alternative, that becomes politically incorrect as well, and that becomes replaced by something else. So think of the kind of geographical examples here of the word third world. So it used to be underdeveloped, and then that was considered to be disrespectful to groups of countries. So then it became third world, and then third world was replaced by developing world, and then it was replaced by something like majority world. So this is what linguists call the euphemism treadmill, that actually all you're doing is you're changing the labels to describe these things. You're not actually changing the way that people feel about them. Okay, so it's a very interesting area of language to look at in terms of language change. And as I said at the beginning, it's never very far away from the news. You now should be equipped to be able to put together a good essay answer that would, for this particular question, evaluate the idea that language change should not be a cause for anxiety. So you need to think about all of the stuff that we've covered so far on the course. We've looked at the difference between prescriptive and descriptive attitudes. We've looked at a little bit at the history of English. We've looked at lexical change and semantic change and people's attitudes towards lexical and semantic change, both now and through history. And that should equip you to be able to do a decent job in answering that question. Here are the different possible areas that you could be discussing. So you could be discussing the differences between prescriptive and descriptive attitudes to language and how that links in with anxiety. You could be looking at how and why new words enter the language, how they entered the language in the past, how they're entering the language now, and is this a cause for anxiety? You could be thinking about archaisms, so outdated words that disappear from the language. So is that process a cause for concern? And then you could be thinking about neosemy. So that's the idea of how and why words change in meaning over time. Should people be concerned that words naturally seem to change in meaning over time? So what are the present day complaints that people make about other people's language? What complaints can you think of from history over the last few centuries, things that we've covered where people have showed concern about language changing? And you might want to think about sort of current day phenomenon, things like dialect leveling and the emergence of new kind of accents and dialects. So the very existence of things like MLE, for example, multicultural London English, is this a cause for anxiety, or indeed is it a cause for some kind of celebration? And you might want to discuss the sort of things that we've been looking at in the last few slides about politically correct language and the attempts to encourage people to use different forms of language. Is this to be resisted? Is this a cause for anxiety? Or is this something to be encouraged? Plenty for you to be getting your teeth into in this particular question. Okay, thank you very much. See you another time.